surveyor. I've done this job for 22 years. That wasn't the intention when I started. But yeah, I've worked on all sorts of different projects, from sort of the sublime to the ridiculous, and really interesting stuff, like working at Headingley Stadium when I was at Leeds City Council, working on student accommodation, PRS, private rented apartment schemes in Manchester, and anything in between. So,
what's been your most memorable job, John?
I think for me, most memorable job is probably the stuff I did at Headingley Stadium when I was at Leeds City Council. I think it's much broader than just bricks and mortar. You're dealing with kind of human behaviour, and it kind of ties in a lot of different things. So that's been really, really interesting.
It sounds it. It's quite a stadium to be involved in.
Yeah. It's really unique because you've got the cricket ground and the rugby ground, and they share a stand in the middle. It's like a double-sided stand. And they've since done a lot of redevelopment work, but when I was there, it was dealing with the old stock, and it was just really interesting to deal with.
Fabulous.
So loving the building control world then? Still in it?
Yeah, still love it. What I originally intended to do was spend 3 or 4 years working in building control, gaining regs experience, and then go into sort of project management and use that knowledge to support clients developing schemes. And I never kind of got to the second bit, but yeah, it's good.
That's the beauty of construction, though, isn't it? You never kind of know which path you're going to go down.
Yeah, and we get to see so many different types of projects. So
yeah,
really, really, really good.
Lovely. Well, look, the reason we wanted you to come on, John, is, I'll be honest, Building Safety Act, Grenfell, huge, topic that's just bouncing about. And I'll be honest, mate, there isn't many people that like to talk too much about it openly in public domain, apart from you. And I see the posts, and I was just saying to Caroline before we came on that without that, we don't learn as an industry. Everyone's keeping their head below the parapet. They don't want to say things that might then pull them back, later on and catch them out. Yeah. Whereas actually, at the end of the day, you're not saying anything that's out of turn. You're just helping everybody else understand it. And even people like me that sat back, there's changes happening all the time. At least you're there putting it out into the domain. So appreciate that for one. And yeah, that's why I wanted to kind of get you on here to talk about it a little bit more. So you just take us back, really, just to the beginning, if you can, just to, there'll be people listening probably that have no idea about what's going on. And so if you just take us back, you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning, but just to give us some context into how we got here.
I think you can't talk about the Building Safety Act without talking about sort of the Grenfell disaster, and that was the trigger as to reform the sector. Horrific event, and we've seen across the world that these issues aren't unique to the UK. We've seen last month fire in Spain, a similar type of fire, a cladding fire. We've seen them in the Middle East, but it really set a catalyst for change within the UK building regulations. With the Hackett review, and then the government's proposal of how we improve the system. So that's where the Building Safety Act comes in. But the Building Safety Act is a multi-layered document, and it's part of other legislation as well. So, but it really changes the way that we should be approaching projects from a compliance side, from building control, and also from the side of the designer and introducing roles in from a compliance side of principal designer, where that's kind of only been limited to really CDM legislation. So it's it really kind of makes a few significant changes across any type of project, not just high rise.
Yeah. So with that, with the principal designer part then, and then what we're hearing recently about the principal designer and building regulations, there seems to be a new set of legislation that's come in as the project moves through the gateway. Am I right in saying?
Yeah. So for high-rise buildings, we have 3 gateways now. So any project that has to go through a series of steps before it can start on site, and then some extra work before it can be completed. The first one is planning stage, gateway 1, and that's there to set the fire safety principles of the project. It's been in a couple of years now, just about. So it's one that if you've got a building over 18 metres and it's on site now, it's likely to have gone through that process. And for newer projects that will have been submitted since October, there is a Gateway 2 that's kind of been brought in through the Building Safety Act. And Gateway 2 is the submission of all the design information by the principal designer, and that's typically going to be the architect or the one that's got the most design responsibility on the project. And they would collate the design information from various subcontractors, third parties that might be designing, such as facade manufacturers. There might be fire engineers producing fire strategies. They collate all that information and then they submit that to the regulator at Gateway 2. The big difference from traditional projects is that you can't make a start on site until the regulator has approved your scheme. They can approve it with conditions, but it needs to be approved, and any of those conditions will have to be met prior to that element of work starting on site. So there's a real shift in design responsibility and making sure that the project is compliant on paper before it even gets to site. And it's trying to make sure that gap between what's designed and what's built is narrowed as much as possible.
Do you find that there's any delays associated with that now, given that that's an extra kind of step that people have to go through?
It does. It's causing some delays. I think the impression that I've had from speaking to people in the industry is that the process isn't yet as streamlined as they would like with the regulator. Some people listening might think that's me being kind, but we are in a new process, and what the process is still being, they're still bringing people in to fulfill roles within that process. So there is going to be a little bit of a delay, but the regulator is doing what they can do within the legislation and making sure that they're working with the resources that they've got. So it's not as quick though. Do
you think that'll have an impact on people's choices on what they actually build, given that they've got this new step that they have to go through, and the fact that might cause additional delays? I think they'll step away from doing more high rise.
Yeah, it'll cause delay. That design process. I've been working on a project where they have to. It won't go through under the prior legislation, so they're going to have to submit it to the regulator. And the timescales from, they've shifted their start on site date by about 8 months to make sure that they can submit all that information and make sure it's been validated before it's submitted. Because if they don't, it's last thing you want to do is submit the information and then get it knocked back, because then you're in the process of it delays it even further. So you could soon be sort of 4 or 5 months away from your original anticipated starting date if you looked at it in enough detail. And that's where the principal designer really comes into their own, and they can either undertake that role themselves, or they can appoint a building regulations expert as an advisor to them, so that they've got the assurances that information that they've got has been validated through that process.
So in essence, it's probably going to open up another whole set of job roles that are going to accompany the design process. So I think that's probably something that, as the years come by, it's going to be more of a standard role that needs to be addressed as part of the upcoming skills.
Yeah, I think it will. It'll change, and I think as most buildings that these regulations affect the most, the high-rise buildings, as most of them have got an appointed fire engineer now. They'll have a consultant to the principal designer for building regulations, like they'll have a consultant for CDM, and but that changes the dynamic within the building control sector, because then you look at an already under-resourced sector being further diluted by these new roles, because it's traditionally going to be people from the building regs background that fulfill them. So it changes the dynamic across the industry.
Interesting.
Just on the building inspectors, there's been a bit of a fallout. Listening to some stories, you're getting a lot of people working within building control, kind of leaving post because they're feeling like they've got all this new pressure that they never had before. We're seeing them move into different type of roles, and is that just me putting a narrative on it, or is that actually a thing where people are feeling like this wasn't what we signed up for? Now all of a sudden I'm being tasked with all this, so actually getting out. Is that actually a thing?
I think people are leaving our sector. I think I don't know what the numbers are, but I think you do see. I've seen colleagues that have decided to retire. I've seen people switching to different roles within different sectors, and I think in the short term, these building control expertise can be used in things like the warranty market and more general surveying. But as we've seen from the CIOB, they're starting to roll out competence assessments for main contractors under the PASS scheme that has been introduced by the British standards. So I think we're going to see these kind of competency benchmarking across lots of parts of the construction sector. So building control were first in the firing line, but I think it is difficult. I found it a difficult and stressful process at time, being able to kind of condense and catalogue your industry experience into a submission where you're going to be assessed by your peers as to whether you're competent to work at that level. But I think, our profession is changing. We're going to become a regulated, licensed profession as of the 6th of April. So, you can't do that without setting some minimum standards. And I think give it 12, 18 months, it'll add some gravitas to the role that we're previously lacking. Building control was the final hurdle to cross, and the bit that people really didn't want to engage with till the last minute. But now I think you're starting to see a bit of the value in the role, which I think is really good. I might have done it for 22 years, but I've still got a lot of time left in the industry, and I think moving forward, if I look at the next 22 years, I think it's a good thing, so we'll see. But it has caused people to become, we're in a sector where there really aren't enough building inspectors for the amount of building work that goes on. So you're in a bit of a pressure cooker environment where people are dealing with a large number of projects, and they have to find time to fulfill this and carry out this assessment process and carry on doing the day job. And in some aspects, maybe, having to do more work because some of the colleagues might be retiring. So it's a real, it's been a real eye opener. But I do think further down the line, it will be a positive thing.
It's like anything else. It's the age-old problem, isn't it? You know, there's more roles, responsibilities that come into our industry, and somebody has to fill that gap. And in the short term, it's the people who are already in it that have to pick up the slack.
Yeah.
You know, so it's addressing that problem as we go forward and saying, okay, well, this is the skills shortage that's going to come through in the next 5-10 years. When people start to retire and people start to disappear, how do we address that now so we don't end up in a problem 5 or 10 years down the line as a sector? There's no easy answer to that.
No, I think that a lot of building control bodies, both LABC and approved inspectors or registered building control approvers, as will all be known next week after next. I think there's apprenticeship schemes, and there's people coming in from different industries and different parts of the construction industry on these apprenticeship pathways, and it's bringing in. But with that, there's a recognition on these pathways that they're going to get to this point at the end. So it's kind of built into the process. So you're not going to get to the end of an apprenticeship or a training program and not become a registered building inspector, because it's all part of it. Like a bit like, when I did my degree, when I did a placement year, and that placement year counted as the first part of your RICS professional assessment, and you can. So you're building in that. If you build in that process into a learning environment, people are just going to be used to it when they get to the end. But like you say, it's the gap. People who are doing it now have to fill that gap whilst you. So, but we'll get there.
Well, we will, absolutely. It's the age-old problem we come across. Every area of the industry has to find a way to sell their profession.
Yeah, but I think building regulations constantly change, and building inspectors kind of roll the sleeves up, understand the new changes, and make sure that developers are building to the new requirements. So we're not being asked to do anything new, and I think it's the same for a lot of designers and who will be the principal designer. Is they have to react to regulation changes, and this is just another regulation change.
Absolutely. So. I guess we threw you off on a tangent there, John, because you didn't get to Gateway 3.
No. So Gateway 3 is if you've navigated Gateway 2 successfully and you've provided all the necessary information during the construction process, and there's been no major issues on site, then you get to Gateway 3, and that is the process of completing the project and then registering it with the regulator as a HRB prior to occupation. So this is all just over 18 metres. So once they've done that, they can they apply to the regulator for a completion certificate. They do provide all their as-built information, all their commissioning information. They'll provide evidence and declarations of compliance from themselves and from other third parties involved. And then the regulator reviews it all, and then they'll issue a final certificate. The timescales for that will, create a delay in the process. So there will be, could be anything between sort of 4 and 12 weeks, depending on how quickly that information is sent through. And then there is also, once they get the completion certificate, they have to register the building prior to occupation. So it's quite a lengthy administrative process, and it's one that everyone has to collaborate with during construction to make sure that all these milestones are met prior to the end of the project. So it's going to be a change, especially when we deal with a lot of people who work in student accommodation and mixed commercial resi buildings, and it condenses. Everything's to the last minute of the last day, and but this kind of puts a brake on that process and makes sure that everything is where it should be prior to that building being handed over and occupied. I think it's been really clear to me, and I suppose to me as a regulator, where we are with those type of buildings. I think the biggest change is for buildings that aren't high-rise buildings, because the change that's affecting every other type of project is one that people haven't really talked about.
Okay.
And it is, it's causing delays in new applications being submitted, and there's a large number of people who are designers who don't really understand who that they're going to be a principal designer under the legislation, and they have to make declarations as well. So whether you're doing a house extension as a designer and a builder, or you're doing, you're building a 4 or 5 story office building, or refurbishing something like that, there is a principal designer, and that is the person who's produced the drawings, typically, or the design lead if it's a large project. And then there is a principal contractor, and that is the person who's got the responsibility for delivering the project on site, who will make subcontractor appointments, whether that's your kind of jobbing builder who appoints an electrician to do the electrics and a plumber to do the plumbing, and a truss manufacturer to produce roof trusses that go on the top of the extension, or whether it's something more fundamental like piling subcontractors. There is the principal designer and principal contractor. So when we, as a building control body, take an application on board, we have to know who the principal designer is, and if there is a principal contractor, who that is, because that under the Building Safety Act defines those responsibilities under the legislation.
That be with every project then, John,
It does. It happens on every project. If it's a domestic project, the domestic client could be the principal designer, and there could be the principal contractor. But the way the legislation is written, it's almost written in a way that kind of discourages that function. And the idea is that we're building a structured project team almost on every project. So they make the submission, and then when they make that submission as well, they declare that submission is, in their view, compliant and meets the requirements of the regulations. And then when they get to the end of the project, there are declarations as well that say that the work that they've done meets the regulations and is compliant as a principal designer and principal contractor. So it creates, it should create more dialogue between the person carrying out the design and the person doing the construction. And we should get away from the use of things like building notices with local authorities, or someone trying to build a house or an extension just on planning drawings. There needs to be more forethought and more detail in that process. So that's been a real challenge, and I think that's the one that's kind of gone under the radar a little bit. People talk about principal designers in the context of large schemes and big developments, but they never talk about it in the case of an architectural technologist or a building surveyor that's producing design information on various types of projects.
And when we're talking about those smaller projects, do you think the people that are involved who haven't typically undertaken that role, do you think they're comfortable in actually undertaking the principal designer role? Because I heard some murmurings around the industry, that has a lot more responsibility now, and that role almost is looked upon, and it's a red flag to say, okay, well, I'm not going to put my name to it. Yeah,
I think there is a nervousness.
Yes.
At the least, but from if I keep my kind of pure regulator kind of hat on, it's nothing. All it's doing is confirming what has always been there. It's always been the responsibility of the designer to produce a design that's compliant and the contractor to build a scheme that's compliant. I suppose now it's putting a name to that process, and people are nervous about the implied responsibility, but it's always been there. And one of the huge things we've seen out of all the Grenfell inquiry and other inquiries is that there's been a real lack of evidence in who was making decisions and where the decisions were being made, and this kind of draws a line on that and makes sure that the legislation delivers that responsibility matrix, and people know that they are responsible for the designs that they undertake and the submissions that are made. And someone might go, well, I don't need my architect or my architectural technologist or surveyor to produce anything beyond planning. We'll pick that up after that. But then that does, it separates that responsibility. So once someone makes a building reg submission, even if they've not produced the drawings, they're effectively the principal designer. They're the ones that are making that submission at that point. So I think there'll be a nervousness after planning. And then it's making sure that people understand that they can't just start chopping and changing things.
Which brings me on to a question, actually. I do, because I was asking this in a room not so long ago, and I don't think anyone really had the answer. But when we come to design and build contracts, how are they going to be navigated? Because obviously that is just a law to itself in some aspects. It'll go through, and then the whole design and build contracts were set up so we can save money while keeping compliant. Yet it goes against everything we're trying to do in a way. There's an argument to completely shut off D&B completely, but how are we navigating through that?
Yeah, the government this week have published, so week commencing the 25th of March, they've published some guidance for design and build contracts under the Building Safety Act on how to navigate that. And for me, as and speaking to some contractors that do D&B, some are happy to take on that principal designer / principal contractor role because that's what they really did anyway under a D&B contract. That they took on the responsibility to design a compliant scheme and build it. I think the difference now is the recognition that it can't be inherently with design and build. They often elements were build and design, and you were catching up on design information, and it was being agreed in flight. The way that the legislation's written, and the guidance that's come out is that's not the right way of doing it, and it should create a bit of a pause. And the D&B contractors that I've been involved with are setting up kind of a validation process before they start work on site, and making sure that, because if they make the submission, they've got to make the declaration of who the principal designer and principal contractor is. So the legislation inherently brings in a break. So it will mean that D&Bs aren't appointed on the Friday and site clearance starts on the Monday. There'll be a bit of a process. 6 to 12 weeks of design validation and before work gets to site. So
we're kind of bringing a bit of a traditional method into it, then, aren't we? Really,
it'll become a bit of a hybrid system, really. Yes. So because there'll be D&Bs that don't want to design responsibility, so you almost end up by default a traditional contract with a designer and a contractor that builds it, because they won't want that function. So it'll be interesting to see it in practice. I think the guidance is really helpful, but the proof will be in the actual working on site.
How accessible do you think the guidance is? Do you think it's openly out there at the moment and people know where to find it, or And when they do find it, is it understood?
No.
I suspected that might be the answer.
One of the frustrating things I've come across with this process is that as the Building Safety Act information has evolved before we got to the legislation, it kind of fell into two camps. So before the building regulator was officially formed, a lot of the guidance came from central government, but they're not very good at storing that guidance in chronological order in an accessible environment, because it comes from, some of it might come as under the building regulations, and some of it might come under central government department. So although they're part of the same, effectively, team, they're signposted in different places on websites. So you could spend an inordinate amount of time trying to understand how one piece of guidance arrived at the next piece, and not being able to either find one or the other. And then we've got to the point where, like, the regulations came in October, and now we've got guidance for design and build contracts, and it's 6 months later.
Yeah.
The process for registering building inspectors, it came really into, people knew what was going on end of October, beginning of November last year. And it's a lot of it has come last minute, and I think that's the frustration, especially as working in building control. We're struggling to digest the information, understand its nuances, and whether the intent from government is followed through in the legislation. And as practitioners, there's been instances where you read what they think the legislation tells them they can do, and when you actually go, well, in practice that doesn't work, there's a bit of head scratching. And so it all feels like we've been on this journey for a number of years, and it's all coming sort of the 11th hour. And it's really frustrating, because it does mean that the guidance that comes out is coming from people like myself and other people within the industry who are trying to interpret what's the legislation and then provide to fill that gap. So, and I think it's changed as well with the HSE being in charge of building regs effectively now. So their approach is slightly different. So, because they work on a lot of risk, and risk is determined by the individual or the organisation in question. They're not going to tell you what you have to do, because it should reflect your own business practices or the types of things that you do. So that's a change. I'm seeing people work from a HSE background and a CDM background now being involved more in building control businesses to try and kind of shape, this is the legislative and regulatory world you're entering. This is how these people operate as a regulator, and trying to kind of get people to understand that things will be a little bit different.
So really, you've got your work cut out for you then.
Yeah. Well, it's and the thing is, people don't stop building, so you're doing it. It's kind of build and regulate, not design.
Just with the industry in general, so I've not actually had any live examples of being involved in it. All of my work, especially kind of has been from a distance. It's hearing things that are happening. It's always, it's coming. Are people proactively trying to get on board with this and make it work? Or does it feel like you're constantly trying to push it down the people who need to know, get it under their nose? Does it feel a bit like that?
I do see that there's the large number of organisations, I think, especially the bigger contracts, who are going to be across, the gateway projects that require the gateway submissions and those that are affected just by the broader legislation, they're more engaged. Because they're always working sort of 6 to 12 months down the road. Your big contractors, so they've been really good on how they work and approach things. I think we're still seeing aspects of people asking us to tell them whether something complies rather than them putting a case for compliance to us. And that's an education process, I think, which will go on for the next sort of 12, 18 months as people understand that dynamic has changed with the legislation. But I do feel like people are acting positively to try and get this over the line and be ready and understand what's going on. And it comes out with, I do CPD events, and you can have 100 people on an online CPD event because people just want the information. They want to know, is there anything that they've missed? Is there anything new that's come out? Is there anything that's going to help them understand their roles and responsibilities?
Yeah.
So it's good on the whole. I think the engagement from industry from a professional capacity has been good. I think that on the smaller stuff, that's where the gap needs filling.
And it's almost, how do we get to that audience? And hopefully, by doing things like what we're doing today, it'll help people to get a little bit more insight into what changes are happening and where they can get that information from. Because I think that's key. Where do people actually access the information? That's not just looking at the legislation; it's actually in something that's understandable and simple and easy for them to see.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is there anywhere people could go, John, literally to get documents, or is it scattered across the clouds? We've got to go 25 different websites to get it all. Is there any one place?
I've not seen any one place.
Okay.
I might finish this and register a website.
I think you should, John.
Yeah. But I think, the professional bodies are working really hard from across the construction sector to provide some guidance. There are a number of different approved inspectors, or registered building control approvers, as will be from April the 6th, providing support and guidance. I think, for anyone who's unsure, reach out to your building inspector that you use on a regular basis and see what information they can share with you or point you in the right direction.
Yeah. So if you were going to pick kind of the top 5 points about the Building Safety Act, what would the key takeaways be of that?
Top 5 points. Wow.
Yeah. Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I think for me, top 5 things that I would recommend that people do is allow the time to produce a robust design. I would understand and read about the roles as a principal designer. It shouldn't be anything that's they're already familiar with, but it's something that they need to pick up. Then a good tender process with the contractors, making sure that they identify how they're going to undertake their responsibilities as principal contractors. And again, allow the time for that, and allow for the golden thread as well. So if there's any significant design changes, if you appoint a contractor and they say, I'm not going to use that roof material, I'm going to use this material instead, that it's recorded and it's agreed mutually. And I think so. I've got 4 there, is it? And then
Please another one out.
Last one, I think, is just if you're in doubt, ask.
Yeah,
I think
No, definitely. I'll be honest. When we were talking about doing this, like the reason, like we say, to get you on is because it's that, it's asking questions, and if we don't ask, no one knows. So, me for one's really appreciative of you posting on LinkedIn, like whether
Yeah.
get shots fired, it doesn't matter because it allows people like me to go on and read it, and people don't want to talk about it, John. I think some of people are a bit scared, so really appreciate that you are talking about it and keep doing it.
No,
People are learning.
yeah, and I think there has to be some honest feedback about how this process goes, especially when dealing with the regulator. It's a new department, it's a new part of the HSE, and if it's a process that's kind of abrasive and doesn't allow for collaboration and an open discussion, then people aren't going to be engaged with it, and it's going to take longer to get through this process of this introduction of this new way of working, because people will they'll deal with it where they need to, and blame that as the fault that there's delays because they can't get hold of somebody or they can't there's nobody there to give them the guidance on what they need to do.
Yeah.
So honest open feedback at this stage is, for me, is something that's going to be essential in making a success of it. So
John, will anybody can reach out to you on LinkedIn?
Yes, brilliant.
My details are on LinkedIn.
Yeah, there you go.
I've got loads of information on there in relation to, I posted on Building Safety Act, provided links to guidance and written a few little bits myself. That'll continue to do so, try and be a bridge between regulators and the people who are making the submissions and being a voice for the industry.
We appreciate that, John.
There we go.
Appreciate it. Lovely. So thanks for your time, and I guess for our listeners, tune in for the next podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, John.
I know I will.
All right. Cheers, John.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Bye.